A decision has been made. It is time for the Oath Pact to end. We will go our ways, and we will not seek out one another. Our blades must be left. The Oath Pact ends now." He lifted his sword and rammed it into the stone with the other 7. Jezrien hesitated, looking at the sword, then bowed his head and turned away, as if ashamed. Kalak watched Jezrien depart across the burned landscape. Finally, he summoned his own blade and slammed it into the stone beside the other 8. He turned and walked in the direction opposite from Jezrien. And yet he could not help glancing back at the ring of swords and the single open spot, the place where the 10th sword should have gone. The one of them who was lost, the one they had abandoned. "Forgive us," Kalak thought, then left. Book 1. The Way of Kings. Sezth, son Vellano, truthless of Shinovar, wore white on the day he was to kill a king. The white clothing was a Parshendi tradition, foreign to him. But he did as his masters required and did not ask for an explanation. As Sezth passed the drummers, they noted him. They would withdraw soon, along with all of the other Parshendi. They did not seem offended. They did not seem angry. And yet they were going to break their treaty of only a few hours. It made no sense. But Sezth did not ask questions.
"Tell my brother. He must find the most important words a man can say."
Gavilar fell still.
"I am sorry, King of the Alethi. I doubt that you care. Not anymore, at least."
He stood up.
"At least you won't have to watch the world ending with the rest of us."
Beside the king's body, his shard blade materialized from mist, clattering to the stones now that its master was dead. It was worth a fortune. Kingdoms had fallen as men vied to possess a single shard blade. Shouts of alarm came from inside the palace. Sezth needed to go. But tell my brother. To Seth's people, a dying request was sacred. He took the king's hand, dipping it in the man's own blood, then used it to scrawl on the wood, "Brother, you must find the most important words a man can say." With that, Sezth escaped into the night. He left the king's shard blade. He had no use for it. The blade Sezth already carried was curse enough. Kaladin charged the chasm, not even flinching as men were slaughtered around him. There always seemed to be a reason Kaladin survived when those he'd tried to help died. Some men might have seen that as a blessing, but he saw it as an ironic kind of torment. Everyone he'd tried to protect, from Tien to Sen, had ended up dead. What was the point? It wasn't bravery that drove him. It wasn't even a wish that those arrows would take him and end it all. He ran. That was what he did. This was his life, day in and day out. Like a boulder rolled down a hill, or like rain fell from the sky. They didn't have a choice. Neither did he. He wasn't a man. He was a thing. And things just did what they did. This war had been going on since the old king's death, nearly 6 years ago. Everyone told stories of that night, the night when Parshendi tribesmen had murdered King Gavilar. The bridgemen laid their bridges in a tight line. 4 crews had fallen. Kaladin's own team had lost nearly enough to stop them. Bridge placed, Kaladin turned away, the army charging across the wood to start the real battle. He stumbled back across the plateau. After a few moments, he found what he was looking for. The youth, the one that reminded him of Tien, the boy's body. Kaladin stood, wind whipping at his hair, looking down at the corpse. It lay face up in a small hollow in the stone. Another bridgeman had fallen nearby, bristling with arrows. It was the man who'd lived through Kaladin's first bridge run all those weeks back. His body slumped to the side, lying on a stone outcropping a foot or so above the corpse of the boy. Blood dripped from the tip of an arrow sticking out his back. It fell, one ruby drop at a time, splattering on the boy's open, lifeless eye. A little trail of red ran from the eye down the side of his face, like crimson tears. That night, Kaladin huddled in the barrack, listening to a high storm buffet the wall. He curled against the cold stone. Thunder shattered the sky outside. I can't keep going like this, he thought. I'm dead inside as sure as if I'd taken a spear through the neck. The storm continued its tirade. And for the first time in a year, Kaladin found himself crying.
Sadeas tells me he has won 3 gem hearts in the last few weeks alone.
He has indeed, Dalinar said, approaching.
How many have you won?
Including the one today?
No, the king said, before this.
None, Your Majesty, Dalinar admitted.
It's Sadeas's bridges, Elhokar said. They're more efficient than yours.
I may not have won anything the last few weeks, but my army has won its share of skirmishes in the past, and the gemstones can go to damnation for all I care.
But what have you done lately?
I have been busy with other important things.
Sadeas raised an eyebrow. More important than the war? More important than vengeance? Is that possible? Or are you just making excuses?
Dalinar gave the other High Prince a pointed look.
Sadeas just shrugged.
Sadeas, Gavilar, and Dalinar had been good friends up until the king's death. Everyone knew it. They had conquered Alethkar together. They were allies, but they were not friends. Not any longer.
You should switch to bridges like his, Elhokar said.
Your Majesty, Dalinar said, Sadeas's bridges waste many lives.
But they are also fast, Sadeas said smoothly. Relying on wheeled bridges is foolish, Dalinar. Getting them over this plateau terrain is slow and plodding.
The codes state that a general may not ask a man to do anything he would not do himself. Tell me, Sadeas, would you run at the front of those bridges you use?
I wouldn't eat gruel either, Sadeas said dryly, or cut ditches.
But you might if you had to, Dalinar said. The bridges are different. Stormfather, you don't even let them use armor or shields. Would you enter combat without your plate?
The bridgemen serve a very important function, Sadeas snapped. They distract the Parshendi from firing at my soldiers. I tried giving them shields at first, and you know what? The Parshendi ignored the bridgemen and fired volleys onto my soldiers and horses. I found that by doubling the number of bridges on a run, then making them extremely light, no armor, no shields to slow them, the bridgemen work far better. You see, Dalinar, the Parshendi are too tempted by the exposed bridgemen to fire at anyone else. Yes, we lose a few bridge crews in each assault, but rarely so many that it hinders us.
Dalinar frowned. Brother, Gavilar had written, you must find the most important words a man can say. A quote from the ancient text, The Way of Kings. It would disagree strongly with the things Sadeas was implying.
Regardless, Sadeas continued, surely you can't argue with how effective my method has been.
Sometimes, Dalinar said, the prize is not worth the costs. The means by which we achieve victory are as important as the victory itself. Sadeas looked at Dalinar incredulously. Even Adolin and Renarin, who had come closer, seemed shocked by the statement. It was a very un-Alethi way of thinking. With the visions and the words of that book spinning in his mind lately, Dalinar wasn't feeling particularly Alethi.
"The prize is worth any cost, Bright Lord Dalinar," Sadeas said. "Winning the competition is worth any effort, any expense." "It is a war," Dalinar said, "not a contest." "Everything is a contest," Sadeas said with a wave of his hand. "All dealings among men are a contest in which some will succeed and others fail. And some are failing quite spectacularly." "My father is one of the most renowned warriors in Alethkar," Adolin snapped, butting into the group. The king raised an eyebrow at him, but otherwise stayed out of the conversation. It was the dusk of the day the boy had died. Kaladin slid on his sandals, the same ones he'd taken from the leathery-faced man on that first day, and stood up. He walked through the crowded barrack. There were no beds, just one thin blanket for bridgemen. One had to choose whether to use it for cushioning or warmth. You could freeze or you could ache. Those were bridgemen's options, though several of the bridgemen had found a third use for the blankets. They wrapped them around their heads, as if to block out sight, sound, and smell, to hide from the world. The world would find them anyway. It was good at these kinds of games. This was an hour or so before the riddens, and was as early as one would want to go out in a high storm. Well, one never wanted to go out in a high storm, but this was about as early as it was safe to go out. The lightning had passed. The winds were manageable. He passed through the dim lumberyard, hunched against the wind. Branches lay scattered about like bones in a white spine's lair. Leaves were plastered by rainwater to the rough sides of barracks. Kaladin splashed through puddles that chilled and numbed his feet. That felt good. They were still sore from the bridge run earlier. Waves of icy rain blew across him, wetting his hair, dripping down his face and into his scruffy beard. "Out for a stroll, your lordship?" a voice said. Kaladin looked up to find Gaz huddled in a nearby hollow between two of the barracks. "What are you doing?" Gaz demanded. "Don't think you can run away. There are still sentries. "I'm going to the honor chasm," Kaladin said quietly. His voice would barely be audible over the storm. Gaz shut up. The honor chasm. There was a certain deference given to men who took that road. Kaladin continued to cross the courtyard. "Lordling," Gaz called. Kaladin turned. "Leave the sandals and vest," Gaz said. "I don't want to have to send someone down to fetch them." Kaladin pulled the leather vest over his head and dropped it to the ground with a splash, then left the sandals in a puddle. That left him in a dirty shirt and stiff brown trousers, both taken off a dead man. Kaladin walked through the storm to the east side of the lumberyard. A low thundering rumbled from the west. The pathway down to the shattered plains was familiar to him now. He'd run this way a dozen times with the bridge crews. Many bridgemen had trouble making decisions. The same happened to men who were shocked by battle. Kaladin felt those effects in himself. Even deciding to come to the chasm had been difficult. But the bleeding eyes of that unnamed boy haunted him. He wouldn't make himself go through something like that again. He couldn't. He reached the base of the slope, wind-driven rain pelting his face as if trying to shove him back toward the camp. He kept on, walking up to the nearest chasm. The honor chasm, the bridgemen called it, for it was the place where they could make the one decision left to them. The honorable decision. Death. Kaladin looked out over the plains. He couldn't see much through the darkness and rain. No, this place wasn't natural. The land had been broken, and now it broke the people who came to it. Kaladin walked past the ladders, a little farther along the edge of the chasm. Then he sat down,
legs over the side, looking down as the rain fell around him, the droplets plunging into the dark depths. Kaladin watched the drops of water streaking down toward oblivion in the crevasse. Little suicidal jumpers. Thousands upon thousands of them. Millions upon millions. Who knew what awaited them in that darkness? You couldn't see it, couldn't know it until you joined them, leaping off into the void and letting the wind bear you down. "You were right, Father," Kaladin whispered. "You can't stop a storm by blowing harder. You can't save men by killing others. We should all become surgeons. Every last one of us." Once his life had seemed simple. That was before he'd lost his brother, before he'd been betrayed in Amaram's army. Would Kaladin go back to those innocent days if he could? Would he prefer to pretend everything was simple? No. He'd had no easy fall like those drops. He'd earned his scars. He'd bounced off walls, bashed his face and hands. He'd killed innocent men by accident. He'd walked beside those with hearts like blackened coals, adoring them. He'd scrambled and climbed and fallen and stumbled. And now here he was, at the end of it all, understanding so much more, but somehow feeling no wiser. He climbed to his feet on the lip of that chasm and could feel his father's disappointment looming over him, like the thunderheads above. He put one foot out over the void.